"Let's move to the next building, boys." The residents panicked and tried to explain that the attack was the cigarette lover's fault, and that if Zhang took them out, he'd be killing innocent people. Zhang let out a laugh and told them that not a single one of them was innocent, and that every person in the building had taken out at least 5 others. He added that he didn't care whether they were good or bad, viewing them as nothing more than walking dead. Sure enough, Zhang kept moving from building to building, burning them down and wiping out their residents completely. News began to spread that he had taken care of the 5 buildings whose leaders had participated in the assassination attempt. At that point, Zhang grabbed a megaphone to make an important announcement, mentioning that he would spare the remaining buildings for now. Speaking into the megaphone, he declared at the top of his lungs that he would never harm innocent people, and that he had taken his revenge on the ones who tried to take him out. Naturally, this brought immense relief to the residents of the other buildings. They began to convince themselves that Zhang was actually a good guy, and that he'd only been forced to eliminate the residents of the 5 treacherous buildings. He acted that way simply because he was afraid they might try to take him out later. As our hero walked away, we see 2 of his men warming themselves by the fire, tossing human bodies into it and using them as fuel. Meanwhile, near Building 25, Zhang is watching the traitors and muttering that he can't understand why they betrayed him, especially since he had been treating them better than anyone else. That prompted him to search their phones, hoping to find something useful. The moment he opened their latest messages, it all made sense. He realized what was going on, though he didn't mention what it actually was. After that, Zhang went up to his apartment to check on Uncle Lao. He was thrilled to find that Lao's condition had finally stabilized. He thanked Zhou and told her that he didn't know how he would have saved Lao without her. Right then, the treacherous Qi jumped into the conversation as usual, telling Zhang that she and her daughter needed to eat since they hadn't eaten all day. To her surprise, Zhang pulled out a pack of instant noodles from his storage and tossed it on the floor. But right as he was about to leave, she called out to him and asked if there was anything else to eat, pointing out that she had seen eggs in the kitchen and chicken bones in the trash. That was when Zhang reached his breaking point and snapped that there was no food left except the instant noodles. Qi finally fell silent. Zhang went with Zhou to their room. He asked Zhou about Lao's condition and how much time he would need to recover. Zhou replied that his condition had been critical and that it should have been impossible to treat him. But suddenly, strange changes were taking place in his body. He was getting much stronger than before, and the wounds were closing and healing at a bizarre speed. Zhang couldn't believe his ears, but he understood the reason perfectly. Back when the apocalypse hit, due to the intense gamma radiation that spread across the planet, Zhang had unlocked his storage dimension. Since Uncle Lao now had a superpower of his own, it meant that there were likely others out there with different abilities just like Zhang's storage. But what could be the reason why Uncle Lao acquired a superpower while others didn't? That was the question Zhang asked himself. That was when he realized that these abilities only activate when a person is on the verge of death. That was the only thing the 2 of them had in common, with the only difference being that Zhang had come back from the dead, while Lao was saved by our hero just before he died. Once Zhang finished his analysis, he told Zhou to give Lao a dose of sedatives every day until he said otherwise. Zhou, surprised, asked if it had anything to do with the superpower. Zhang replied that he was sure Lao had gained a superpower, but he was afraid Lao might turn into the Incredible Hulk and smash up the apartment. After Zhou promised to do as he asked, he got ready to leave. But she called out and asked him if he was really going to let Qi look after Lao. Zhang replied that Qi was an annoying woman, but she had to take care of Lao because she knew full well that if anything happened to him, she would die too. Zhang went out and called for Qi, telling her she could live in Lao's room as long as she took care of him and fed him instant noodles. After that, Zhang decided to go after the mastermind behind the whole betrayal. He went down a few floors in the same building, armed with his riot shield and pistol, ready for action. Without wasting any time, he fired at the door lock, and within seconds, he burst into the room in a fit of rage. Right then, to his surprise, Yu rushed at him with a knife, trying to take him out. But Zhang was ready for her and blocked the attack with his shield. From the sheer impact, she dropped the knife and fell to the floor. That's when Zhang noticed that she had managed to survive all this time by feeding on her friend. Could easily betray him as well. And Yu started shouting, saying that she thought he was going to die, and that she had no idea all the people she had sent could fail in taking out just one guy. Zhang replied that he already knew she was the one behind the betrayal of the building leaders and his own men, which was exactly why he came to take her out. With her usual audacity, she told him she wouldn't have done it if he hadn't replaced her with a low-class woman like Zhou. But Zhang made it clear that he didn't come to chat, he came to kill her. Right then, he broke her leg with his baton and dragged her by her hair toward the window amidst her screams and desperate pleas to be spared. Zhang ignored her screams, lifted her up by the hair, and told her that she brought this on herself. He then let her fall from the window while she was screaming, commenting that her screaming was like music to his ears. Even though Zhang had officially finished off Yu for good, he felt that this death was way too easy for her after all the disasters she had caused. When he went back up to his apartment, he saw that Zhou had already started giving Uncle Lao his sedatives. Furthermore, Qi asked Zhang to go downstairs and get the charger and baby diapers from her apartment, because Zhang knew that a patient could hear even while in a coma, and to avoid having a negative impact on Lao's condition, he played it cool and told her that he would take care of some important things first and then get her what she needed. But as he left the room, he said to himself that he knew full well she was just afraid to go down and get her stuff herself, because she knew that if she left, he wouldn't let her back into his apartment. After Zhang found the names of all the building leaders involved in the betrayal on the traitors' phones, he went down to finish burning down the rest of the buildings to eliminate any remaining threats in the neighborhood. While he was enjoying the sight of the fire, his thoughts were interrupted by Xiao's voice as he approached and called out to him. Moments later, Xiao started cheering up and told Zhang that he had some major, mind-blowing news for him. Our hero was confused by this and said that he was almost done taking out everyone in the neighborhood, so what could possibly be that important? Then Xiao started asking him if he had heard about the shelter owned by Wang Ximing, the son of the richest man in the city, whose father had built an entire village-sized compound as a shelter when the apocalypse hit. When Zhang asked him if he knew where the bunker was, Xiao replied that they needed to go somewhere quieter so they could talk without anyone overhearing. When they reached a quiet spot, Xiao started telling him everything he knew. He explained that the bunker was located in Yanqi City and had cost around $250 million to build. Xiao made it clear that he was only sharing this info because he needed Zhang's help to break into the bunker and take it over. Zhang let out a laugh, telling Xiao that he wasn't stupid enough to fall for this story. If there was a place that incredible, he surely wouldn't have told Zhang about it. Xiao answered that the security there was incredibly high, which was why he wouldn't dare pull off an operation like this on his own. On top of that, he revealed that Ximing had heard about Zhang a while ago and contacted Xiao, asking for help in taking Zhang down because he wanted Zhang's snowmobile. At that point, Zhang completely lost his temper, unable to hold back his anger, and told him that he was clearly lying to try and convince him to attack Ximing. That made him draw his pistol and tell Xiao that he was starting to suspect this was a setup to walk him straight into a trap, where they would finish him off and take his snowmobile and all his gear. Xiao quickly began to beg him not to jump to conclusions and to trust him just this once, but Zhang fired a bullet right next to him to scare him, forcing him to drop to the floor in pure terror. Xiao started speaking with a shaking voice, swearing that he would never lie about something like that. Zhang asked him for proof that his words were true and that he wasn't setting a trap for him, alongside Ximing. That's when Xiao started to explain that he believed his own chances of survival were much higher with Zhang than with Ximing, who he had bullied Xiao his entire life, and at one point, he even took his girlfriend away right in front of his eyes without Xiao being able to object. Since then, Xiao had become the laughingstock of all the wealthy elites in Tianhai City, and he swore that he would get his revenge on Ximing at the first chance he got. At that point, Zhang started to be somewhat convinced, but asked him what he could bring to the table if they teamed up. Xiao replied that he could easily act like he was still working for Ximing, which would make it easy for him to open the shelter's doors, allowing Zhang to take him out. Zhang then asked about the type of security used in the bunker, the number of guards, and the weapons they had. Xiao refused to tell him anything until they agreed to an alliance, promising that he would provide him with a steady supply of resources in the future. Right then, our hero drew his pistol and threatened to take him out if he didn't speak. But Xiao told him that he wouldn't open his mouth, even if it cost him his life, because he knew very well that Zhang would end him the moment he got the information anyway. Zhang lowered his gun, acknowledging that Xiao was making sense. However, before he agreed to the alliance, he laid out 3 conditions. First, tell him everything about the shelter, from the security systems to the number of guards and weapons. Second, help him take out a specific target to prove his loyalty. Third, Zhang handed him a mysterious black bag, telling him that the final condition would be revealed once they got to the destination. Looking at the black bag, Xiao commented that it looked exactly like the bags used by assassins and detectives. Zhang then told him a shocking truth. He had to confess that he was actually a professional assassin. Xiao bought the story on the spot, especially after having seen Zhang's advanced level of marksmanship and sniping skills firsthand. Just as Xiao was getting excited, thinking that teaming up with Zhang was the best decision he'd ever made, Zhang pulled out a syringe and told him that he'd always used it to extract information from prisoners. Xiao started screaming, asking what the heck he was doing. Zhang replied that it was a toxin used on prisoners and that its effect would kick in after exactly 1 week, killing anyone injected with it unless they got the antidote. Zhang quickly tied Xiao up, injected him with the substance, and told him that they were now in the same boat since he was the only one holding the antidote. Once he let Xiao go, Zhang told him that the remaining step was the assassination task, and that he would send him the details shortly. Xiao replied that he would wait for the message and would contact Ximing in the meantime to get the plan in motion. After Xiao left, Zhang couldn't help but laugh, thinking about how easily Xiao had fallen for the trick. That syringe contained nothing but regular, harmless saline, not poison or anything lethal. However, Zhang knew it would cause mild, flu-like symptoms that mimicked the onset of a toxin, and that Xiao would never know the truth, Because of this, Zhang felt completely reassured that Xiao wouldn't dare betray him as long as he believed the poisoning bluff. Zhang returned to his apartment and was pleasantly surprised to find that Uncle Lao had finally woken up. Zhang went over to greet him and asked how he was feeling. Lao replied that he was doing well, and that if it weren't for Zhang and Zhou, he would be dead. Qi then chimed in, thanking Zhang and saying that their three-person family would remain grateful to him for the rest of their lives. To her surprise, Zhang replied that he had decided to look after her and her daughter for the rest of his life. Right then, Qi's eyes lit up like a sniper's. She told him that a real man never goes back on his word. Once Zhang made it clear that he always keeps his promises, she left the little girl with him, saying she was going down to her apartment to grab her phone charger herself. But as she walked out the door, she thought to herself that she didn't really trust his word, though as long as he had her daughter, she'd be safe. Zhang pulled out his phone and sent a message to Xiao telling him that the person he was going to take out was Qi, and that she was currently heading down to her apartment to get some stuff. Zhang thought about how he had wanted to solve the Qi and daughter problem once and for all, but he just couldn't bring himself to finish off a little girl. Still, he decided that as soon as he had the chance, he'd find someone to adopt her. Meanwhile, Qi was standing outside her apartment, shivering from the cold, imagining herself sitting by the heater inside Zhang's apartment. But the moment she opened her door to grab her things, she was shocked to find Xiao standing there, knife in hand, ready to take her out. Before she could even process what was happening or figure out what Xiao was doing in her apartment, he plunged the knife deep into her chest to end her life once and for all. Coldly, he told her that she had brought this on herself with her actions. He kept stabbing her repeatedly to make sure the job was done, right before messaging Zhang to let him know the mission was accomplished and to ask for some supplies. Zhang didn't waste any time. He went back to Uncle Lao and told him that he had decided to let him, Qi, and her daughter live in his apartment. Lao was surprised and said that he didn't want to be a burden or have Zhang waste his resources any faster. But Zhang cut him off, saying, "The decision is made, Lao," and told him all he had to do was rest, clear his mind, and not worry about a thing until he recovered. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by the little girl bursting into tears. Zhang paced around the room with her, trying to quiet her down, but all his efforts failed. He quickly ran over, handed the baby to Zhou, and told her to figure out how to keep her quiet. Even though Zhou tried to remind him that she had never raised kids before, Zhang brushed it off, handed her some diapers, and walked out. He went back to Uncle Lao and asked if he felt any physical changes in his body. Lao replied that he simply felt completely unable to use any power and that the area around his wound was itching intensely. Lao then asked Zhang to check on Qi because she was taking a while. Zhang called Zhou to keep an eye on Lao and told her he was going down to look for Qi and would be right back. Before heading out, he geared up completely, putting on his protective gear as if he were going into battle. He messaged the building residents group chat, telling them to gather in apartment 1301 so he could distribute the resources. He also sent a message to Xiao, telling him not to attend the meeting unless he wanted to end up dead. Meanwhile, people were gathering in apartment 1301, saying that thanks to Zhang, they had finally taken control of all the neighborhood buildings and would be getting all the resources. But little did they know, Zhang was already standing outside the apartment, laughing at their chatter and thinking to himself that they were about to meet their end. In a split second, he pulled grenades from his pocket and tossed them straight into the room where the residents were gathered. Even though the residents saw the explosives coming, they didn't have enough time to react. The grenades went off, wiping out the vast majority of them and leaving others severely wounded. Once the smoke cleared, Zhang walked in to make sure everyone was dead, but he found one survivor, barely clinging to life, who asked him why he killed them after they had helped him all this time. Zhang replied that he never needed them in the first place, and that they should actually be thanking him for letting them live this long. Zhang then finished off the final survivor. After that, Zhang walked away from the scene, feeling overjoyed. He had finally gotten his revenge and wiped out everyone who had a part in his death in his past life. Now, he could finally live peacefully in his neighborhood without any anxiety or stress. When he returned to his home, Zhang made a sad face and told Lao that he had searched everywhere for Kai, but unfortunately, found out she was dead. He looked deeper into the matter and discovered that the building's residents were trying to betray him, which is why they targeted Kai since she belonged to him. Lao burst into tears out of pure grief, blaming himself and saying that all of this happened because he was weak and couldn't protect her. He squeezed his hand so hard in the hospital bed that he nearly broke it. Zhang stepped in to calm him down, making sure he didn't snap or do anything crazy. He told him it was their fault because the neighbors were just after his resources. Zhang thought to himself that he was now absolutely sure Lao had gained superhuman physical abilities. Zhang continued talking to Lao, telling him not to worry about anything from now on because he took care of all the traitors in the building and got revenge for Kai. Lao immediately believed him, saying that they all deserved to die. With this, Zhang killed 2 birds with 1 stone. He got rid of the neighbors and Kai, while making Lao think Zhang was the victim in the situation. A few moments later, Zhou arrived. She was struggling to calm the baby down, no matter what she tried, and told Zhang that the baby started crying again after quieting down the first time and just wouldn't stop. Zhang replied that the baby must be hungry and pointed to a can to feed her. Joe explained that this wouldn't work because the baby's mother wasn't pregnant and couldn't produce milk. Zhang said he didn't know that and joked that they looked like a total failure of a family. Because of that, he decided he would find her a family that actually knew how to take care of a baby. He added that he was going to find a good family right now, offering to give them enough resources for both them and the baby if they agreed to take her. Zhang went downstairs, taking the baby and his gun with him. He started firing shots into the air and calling out to Jin, telling him to come down immediately. Without wasting any time, Jin came down and asked what Zhang wanted. Surprised, Zhang asked, "How did you come down so fast, knowing I could kill you?" Jin replied that he knew Zhang could, but even if he hid, Zhang could just burn the building down just like he did with the others. Besides, seeing him hold a baby put Jin at ease, because he was sure Zhang wouldn't kill anyone while holding a child. Zhang admitted that Jin was right and that it was exactly what you'd expect from a smart guy like him. Zhang explained that he just came by to drop off the baby and promised in return that he'd never mess with his building, no matter what happened. Zhang also brought out a bag containing food, diapers, and baby formula, assuring Jin that he would keep providing resources for both of them regularly. He warned Jin that he'd drop by to check on them from time to time, and if anything happened to the baby, the whole building would pay the price. Jin promised to take great care of the baby, taking her in the bag and then returned to Zhang. Zhang asked Jin how many people currently lived in his building. Jin answered 67, including himself. Zhang was surprised, saying that was too many people and they wouldn't be able to survive, especially since Zhang wouldn't be giving food to anyone else from now on besides Jin and the baby. Jin replied that they would find a way to survive together or die together. Zhang suggested a simple solution to their food problem for the next few months, pointing to the burned-out buildings and saying they could use the bodies as food for months. However, Jin completely rejected the idea, saying there was no way they would ever do that. Despite life getting harder day by day, they would rather die with their dignity and humanity intact than live like monsters. Zhang was impressed by Jin's words, saying he never expected anyone to keep their humanity after going through such hardships. This pulled him out of his thoughts, and he told Jin that he really admired his character and the way he thought. Jin thanked him but replied that honestly he admired Zhang even more because he saw him as a strong, capable guy who provided resources and protection for everyone around him. This was in contrast to Jin himself, who felt he had failed in his role as the leader of the building. With a serious look on his face, Jin said he wanted to ask Zhang a favor, but Zhang told him not to bother because he already knew what he wanted. Jin asked anyway if Zhang could provide them with at least a quarter of the resources he used to give them every day. Zhang refused to listen to any of it and started walking toward his home. While walking, he explained to Jin that he was just a weak human and couldn't save all these people. Even if he kept providing resources constantly and kept them alive for now, he definitely couldn't do it forever. Besides, he was afraid that if he fed them now, they would betray him later. After all, it was a treacherous post-apocalyptic world where tables turn quickly. Even so, Zhang didn't let Jin leave empty-handed. He gave him some wheat seeds to plant if he wanted, explaining that this was sadly all he could do for him right now. But he added that if they could actually manage to grow these seeds and survive for a while, it would restore his hope in humanity, and he would definitely agree to help them. Zhang walked away, saying that these seeds could either be planted or eaten, so they either had to try to grow them to survive forever, or eat them now to satisfy their hunger and die of starvation once they ran out. After Zhang left, Professor Jai, a professor of agricultural engineering, stepped in and told them they had to try to plant the seeds, even if their chances were almost non-existent in this cold weather. If we shift our focus back to Zhang, we see him saying that the arc of this neighborhood has come to an end, and it's time to look for the beginning of the shelter arc of the rich man's son, Simming. The next morning, while Zhang was enjoying a great drink, he was surprised by a message from Ziyuhao telling him that everything with Simming was perfectly set, and they could go whenever they wanted. Zhang told him to come to his house because he wanted to talk. When Ziyuhao arrived, he was enjoying the warm atmosphere of Zhang's home. Our protagonist welcomed him and told him to have a seat, but he pointed to the floor. Ziyuhao sat down on the floor and told Zhang he was going to tell him about the whole conversation he had with Simming. Zhang replied that he wanted to see the chat himself, as it would be better and easier. Ziyuhao was startled and asked if Zhang meant he wanted his phone. Zhang replied, "Are you an idiot man? How am I supposed to see the chat without taking the phone?" Ziyuhao, looking scared, said that if Zhang was taking his phone, he had to consider something important first. Before he could finish, Zhang put the gun to his head and said, "What, are you trying to play games with me, man?" Ziyuhao replied, "That's not what I meant, boss." He explained that he might have cursed at Zhang in his messages with Simming, but he didn't actually mean those insults. Zhang snatched the phone from him, saying he would find out everything for himself right then. Looking at Ziyuhao's messages, Zhang noticed that Ziyuhao had indeed been cursing him out, calling him just an arrogant kid with a gun who went around killing people because he thought he was tough. This made Zhang turn to Ziyuhao and tell him to explain exactly what he meant by those words. Ziyuhao replied that he was only doing it to trick Simming, and that it was impossible for him to betray Zhang, because he knew very well he would die without the antidote to the poison he had taken. Zhang started getting lost in his thoughts and said to himself that Ziyuhao hadn't told Siming anything except about the gun and the dumplings, which meant Siming didn't know anything about the other types of weapons Zhang had, nor about his other tricks. Because of this, he was confident that taking over Siming's shelter would be super easy. Pulling himself out of his thoughts, Zhang asked Ziyuhao to tell him everything he knew about the shelter, especially the types of weapons, defenses, and secret passages, if any existed. Ziyuhao replied that the shelter's walls and doors were all made from the same metal used for spaceships. This meant it was impossible for anyone to break into the place unless they dropped a nuke on it or used thousands of missiles. Inside the base itself, there were no heavy weapons, but there were lots of traps, such as sleeping gas systems filling the entire shelter and flamethrowers at every entrance. Based on this info, Zhang started cooking up a genius plan in his head. Since Siming was only after his dumplings, it meant that even if Zhang got caught, Siming wouldn't kill him until he found out where the dumplings were hidden. After figuring this out, Zhang asked Ziyuhao if there were any other defensive systems in the shelter besides those. Ziyuhao replied that there was nothing else as far as he knew. Zhang then explained that all they had to do now was go there and pretend they fell into the sleeping gas trap. Once that happened, he would step in himself and kill Siming. Zhang thought to himself that the sleeping gas wouldn't affect him thanks to his gas mask, but he decided not to mention this to Ziyuhao so he could test his loyalty and see his true colors when they got there. After that, Zhang sat by himself, brainstorming a better solution to deal with the gas and flamethrowers. Then a brilliant idea hit him. He could try to use his storage dimension to block these attacks. Why shouldn't he be able to use his storage dimension for defense and offense just like other superpowers? But before he finished thinking it through, he told Ziyuhao to go home and that he would call him in a few days so they could go together to take over Siming's shelter. Ziyuhao grabbed Zhang by the leg, begging him and saying he couldn't wait because he was going to die in about a week. Zhang replied that he wouldn't make him wait that long and that he would contact him in less than 3 days. After Ziyuhao left, Zhang sat by himself for a bit and decided he needed to test storing fire inside his dimension. He gathered some wood, lit it, and made a relatively large fire, saying he would face the flamethrowers and try to absorb their fire into his dimension. Within seconds of starting the storage process, Zhang succeeded in storing it completely, and it had no negative effect on him at all. Then, he tried to focus on the fire and release it from his dimension in a very specific direction, as if he were shooting fireballs right out of his palms. After seeing this happen, Zhang realized that his ability was way more explosive and powerful than he had imagined. This meant he could not only block incoming attacks, but he could actually fire the same attacks back at the attacker. Zhang was also confident that if he practiced using it heavily, it wouldn't be long before he could block long-range attacks like bullets, missiles, and more. However, Zhang had another thing on his mind that was still bothering him. He wanted to know the effect of his storage dimension on living humans. He decided to send a message to all the neighbors, asking them to send someone they didn't need because he wanted to test something on him. They didn't waste any time and sent over a miserable guy no one wanted. Zhang told the guy that he would ask him to do a task, and if he succeeded, he would give him a bag of instant noodles. He threw him a stick and told him to try to hit Zhang with it as hard as he could, and if he managed to strike him with the stick, he would get the noodles. Instantly, the miserable guy lunged forward and tried to attack with all his might, but Zhang started absorbing the guy's stick directly into his storage dimension. The guy tried to run away, but Zhang told him that there was no way he could do that, and began pulling the guy in along with his stick. Inside the storage dimension, he found the guy frozen in his last attack pose. Zhang tried to pull the stick away or move him, but he couldn't get him to budge even an inch. At that moment, he realized that the man's pulse and breathing had completely stopped inside the dimension. Still, he wanted to find out what would happen to him once he was pulled out. As soon as the miserable guy came out of the storage dimension, he seemed startled, saying he thought he was dead and asking how he was still alive. From this, Zhang concluded that if he had left the guy inside the storage dimension for a few seconds longer, he would actually be dead by now. Zhang asked him how he felt while he was in that strange place just moments ago. The guy replied that all he remembered was being in a vast, empty world packed with tons of resources, but he also felt like he had been stuck there for a full century. It was terrifying. At that point, Zhang started to understand why food didn't rot. It was because time inside the storage dimension passed thousands of times slower than in the real world. That's why if he trapped any living human inside, they would go crazy and die, since years inside feel like mere seconds outside. Plus, Zhang noticed he could only keep the guy in the storage dimension for a few moments. But the question on his mind was whether human body parts could be stored for long periods like the resources, or if they would pop out on their own after a short while too. Without a second thought, he chopped off 2 of the guy's fingers to experiment, and through that, he confirmed that he could indeed store human body parts inside his dimension for a long time. After running a few more tests using the miserable guy, our hero reached several conclusions. As the guy was enjoying his meal, which he got from Zhang after all that sweating, our hero said he was now absolutely sure that he couldn't store living humans in his dimension, which meant there was a possibility he couldn't store certain other things either. But the important thing now was that he could use the dimension to block attacks and fire them back, which meant he could easily raid Siming's shelter and take it over. Once Zhang wrapped up his analysis, he thanked the guy for his help. But right as the guy was saying, "You're welcome, boss," Zhang suddenly slashed his throat and killed him on the spot. Strangely enough, when the guy died, he actually looked happy, saying he couldn't believe he was finally leaving this terrifying world where everyone was eating each other. On the other side, Zhang said he needed to run tests on a few more people from the neighborhood to make sure of what he had discovered. 3 days after all these tests, we see Zhang meeting up with Ziyuhao again, telling him he was finally ready to go. Ziyuhao, looking exhausted, said he felt like he was dying. Zhang knew very well that Ziyuhao had been eating well, and that his feeling was definitely just because he was terrified of the poison. This made Zhang explain to him that he could give him a temporary shot to ease the symptoms until they finished raiding the shelter, and then he'd give him the real antidote. Ziyuhao couldn't believe his ears and begged, "Give me the shot quickly, please, I need the dose." Zhang grabbed some tap water, gave him the shot, and told him it was just a painkiller, and that his time of death was still exactly the same. Ziyuhao replied that Zhang didn't need to warn him because he'd never betray him, and he wasn't an idiot who would sacrifice his life for Siming, who used to bully him. Siming then called to let Zhang know that they were already on their way. As Zhang spoke on the phone, he shot a dark, evil look his way. Time flew by and we see Zhang getting ready to leave. After putting on his gear, he said goodbye to Zhou, telling her he would explain everything when the time was right. But right before he walked out the door, she rushed over, hugged him tightly, expressed her concern, and told him to come back safe. Zhang promised her that nothing would happen to him, and told her that he had left her and Zhou with enough resources to last for half a month, just in case he got delayed. After that, Zhang went down to meet up with Ziyuhao to start their trip, but he pulled out a rope and told Ziyuhao that he would tie his hands before they set off. Ziyuhao tried to change his mind and convince him that he was already on his side, but Zhang explained that he wasn't doing this because he didn't trust him. It was just to make their act convincing in front of his friend Siming. Ziyuhao gave in and went along with it, even though he was sure the real reason was that Zhang didn't trust him at all. Finally, they hit the road on the ice sled. After traveling for a while, they arrived at Yanqi City, where the shelter was located. Zhang was amazed by what he saw, noting that this part of the city was a natural fortress, protected by a river in the front and mountains in the back. He also realized that not all the houses there were fortified, but everyone living there was comfortable and had electricity. He mentioned out loud that he thought all people would be equal at the end of the world, not knowing that the rich would still live happier lives than the poor. Because he said this a bit too loudly, Ziyuhao told him that no one was rich compared to Zhang the badass. Zhang told him to drop the flattery and get off because they had to walk the rest of the way. Ziyuhao was surprised and asked how they could just leave the sled in the middle of the snow, and why they were walking when they could just ride it to Siming. Zhang replied that if he asked any more questions, he would finish him off right there. Meanwhile, a woman was watching them from a window, saying that they probably had a lot of resources since they had a sled and were playing around with it like that. We learned from her thoughts that her own resources were almost gone, as they'd been running low for about 3 days, and her power generators would run out in a few hours. Because she was in the same situation as everyone else in that place except Siming, she thought her best chance at survival was to catch the guy with the sled she had just seen. Moving back to our protagonist, he finally arrived with Ziyuhao in front of Siming's house. Zhang pulled out his gun, playing the part of a kidnapper holding Ziyuhao, and told him to go open the door right away or he'd kill him. Ziyuhao ran to the door and started calling out to Siming, telling him to open up quickly. At that moment, Siming was keeping an eye on every angle of his fortified mansion. Seeing Ziyuhao, he was surprised because he had agreed with him to bring Zhang tomorrow, not today, and he was annoyed because he didn't see the sled anywhere. On the other side, Zhang started shouting at Ziyuhao, saying that if the door didn't open, he would blow his brains out on the spot. Seeing what was happening, Siming said he would open the door but threatened to kill Zhang if he tried to pull any fast ones. Our hero then stepped inside with Ziyuhao while pointing the gun at his head, eventually reaching the corridors, which Zhang knew were full of traps. Siming knew they had arrived by watching the cameras and decided to use the sleeping gas on them without giving them a chance to get closer to his room. Suddenly, small panels in the ceiling opened, much to Zhang's feigned surprise, and a massive amount of sleeping gas poured out of the openings all at once. During all this, Siming was watching from his cameras, listening to Zhang putting on a show of yelling at Ziyuhao and demanding that he get Siming to open the door or else he would kill him. A few minutes went by, and as soon as Siming noticed that the 2 men had finally passed out, he decided to go out and tie them up. Meanwhile, after noticing that Ziyuhao had fainted. Realizing this, Zhang understood that he could now absorb the gas into his storage dimension. After all, Siming probably wasn't standing by the cameras anymore because he was heading their way to tie them up before they woke up. Sure enough, just seconds later, the door opened. Zhang knew he had to play dead quickly, but then he noticed that the person coming to get them wasn't Siming, it was someone else entirely. Zhang was annoyed, thinking he didn't know there were other people in this shelter, and if there were many people around, things could get dangerous for him. When the guy approached to tie them up and take them to Simming, Zhang recognized him as the famous actor Lin. Zhang thought to himself that he should have known a rich guy like Simming would have important friends like him. Within moments they reached Simming's place. Zhang and Ziyuhao were dumped on the floor. Lin told Simming that Zhang coming in completely unguarded like this just proved he was a total fool. They started talking among themselves and deciding what to do with the sled once they took it from Zhang. Little did they know Zhang had already started releasing the gas from his storage dimension, letting it spread rapidly through the room. Because Zhang could control the direction of the gas as it surged out, he aimed it straight at Lin, whom Simming thought was just shivering with excitement over the sled. Lin replied that he wasn't shivering. Suddenly, he felt as though Simming had turned into 6 people. At that moment, our hero pulled out a knife, sliced the rope with ease, and stood up as soon as he noticed that both his enemies had passed out. He tied them both up and took their weapons, saying they looked cool but were actually pretty weak. Since Simming was going to take a while to wake up, Zhang decided to take a quick tour of the mansion. He was truly amazed by the massive living room, saying it was truly fit for the son of the richest man. He kept walking through the mansion and, moments later, discovered an entire room dedicated to growing various crops. After finishing his inspection of the first floor, he decided to check out the second floor. Up there, he noticed a room for almost everything, from a wine cellar to a gaming room, a home theater, and much more. But the thing that caught his attention the most was the control room itself, which was filled with devices and buttons he didn't understand at all. He even wished he were a computer engineer so he could deal with such equipment. Even so, when he randomly pressed a couple of buttons, he discovered that there were basketball and shooting courts in the place, and he was thrilled because he loved shooting practice like crazy. But when he went to go check out the courts, he got a shock, realizing that he couldn't access any of these places unless he got the password from Simming. He decided that right now he needed to focus on one thing: how to get the password from the Simming kid. Zhang went back and doused the 2 men with buckets of water to wake them up. He started taunting Simming, saying, "Wake up, your mom made sandwiches." When Simming opened his eyes in a panic, he started asking Zhang, "How did you pull that off, you sly dog?" Our hero replied that Simming was an idiot to think he could catch him so easily, and made it clear that he wasn't his friend to just sit around and chat with him. Zhang pointed the gun at his head, telling him to focus now because his life was on the line. Zhang added that he might let him live under one condition: that Simming cooperate with him and not try to resist. Simming replied that he would do whatever Zhang wanted, even if he wanted him to kill his friend Lin, as long as Zhang let him live, because his own life was more important than anyone else's. Zhang explained that all he wanted was a safe place to live until the blizzards passed, so he wanted Simming to let him stay in his heavily fortified mansion. Zhang promised that if he agreed, he wouldn't hurt him. Simming looked at him in surprise and said,